Hello and welcome to Mullen's Benefits Companion, a podcast that helps employers navigate the complex legal challenges of managing their employee benefit plans. I'm your host, Brydon DeWitt. We're recording this podcast in about mid-January, so Happy New Year to everyone. And I thought it would be good to start the new year with some good news. At the very end of 2024, President Biden signed two pieces of legislation into law that provides some relief to employers who sponsor employer group health plan benefits: the Paperwork Burden Reduction Act and the Employer Reporting Improvement Act. The Paperwork Burden Reduction Act addresses Forms 1094C and 1095C. I know that's a favorite topic of HR folks, of having to prepare the Forms 1095C or Form 1094B and providing those to employees. The Paperwork Burden Reduction Act lifts some of that burden off of employers by making these forms available to participants only on request. So until this act was passed, every year employers had to send the Form 1095Cs to all of the full-time employees. The Paperwork Burden Reduction Act shifts that burden to the employees have to ask for the form. So now 1095Cs do not have to be affirmatively provided every year. They are only provided if employees request them. Now, a catch for this, however, is that the employer still has to send a notice to employees. So the employer has to provide a notice to the employees of the availability of the Form 1095C. The language has to be clear, conspicuous, and it has to be an accessible notice, and it informs the employee of their right to request the forms. The IRS has not yet provided us with any guidance on the content of the form, but right now we're kind of in good faith compliance. So this act applies today, it applies for 2025 for the forms that are due for the 2024 year. So employers provide a notice that clearly states that employees have the right to request a Form 1095C. Then the employer does not have to issue all of those Form 1095Cs to their employees. This doesn't mean, however, that employers no longer have to prepare the Form 1095C. The Form 1095Cs are still required. You still have to file them with the IRS. They're due March 31 if filed electronically, or February 28th if filed on paper. So you still have to do the Form 1095C, but you just don't have to send them to all the employees. Only if employees request the form do you have to provide them, if you have provided that notice that tells them they have the right to request. If an employee requests a Form 1095C, it has to be provided no later than January 31 or 30 days after the date of the request. And again, this applies now for the 2024 year. It applies to the forms that you would otherwise have to distribute this year in 2025. The other piece of legislation that was signed on the same day by President Biden is the Employer Reporting Improvement Act. And one issue that employers have with the 1095Cs is some employees don't have a social security number or a taxpayer identification number. And this act codifies into law that employers can use an employee's date of birth if the employee's tax identification number is not available. The act also provides that Forms 1094B and 1095C may be provided electronically to participants if they consent. So again, you only have to provide these forms if the employee requests the form. And now if they request the form, you can send it to them electronically. If an employer has failed to provide minimum value affordable coverage to an employee, or if the Form 1095C indicates that there was a problem with providing affordable coverage or minimum value coverage, an employer will receive what's called a letter 226J from the IRS saying that the IRS believes the employer owes the employer shared responsibility payment for the months that the employee enrolled in coverage through an exchange. So that letter 226J is the form where the IRS says, hey, we think you owe the employer shared responsibility payment. It used to be that an employer would have only 30 days to respond to a letter 226J. The Employer Reporting Improvement Act extends that deadline to 90 days. So it gives the employer a lot more breathing room to receive the 226J and to determine whether the employer agrees that it owes the employer shared responsibility payment, or if there is some mistake on the form or some reason why the employer does not actually owe the ESRP. Additionally, the Employer Reporting Improvement Act provides for a 6-year statute of limitations for the employer shared responsibility payment. And so the 6-year statute of limitations begins on the later of the due date for filing of the employer's Form 1094C and 1095C with the IRS, or the date those forms were actually filed. So now we have a limitations period where the employer isn't going to be on the hook potentially for the employer shared responsibility payment going back longer than 6 years. Unfortunately, however, this new statute of limitations only applies going forward. So if an employer owes or the IRS believes the employer owes the employer shared responsibility payment for 2025, 6 years from now until 2031, after 2031, the IRS could not seek the employer shared responsibility payment for 2025. But the statute does not apply to employer share responsibility payments owed prior to 2025. So anything before 2025, there's no 6-year statute of limitations period. And the IRS could go back and seek ESRP payments for 2022, for example, because there's no limitations period prior to 2025. So what should employers do in response to this? Well, you still have to timely file the forms 1094B or 1095C. And to take advantage of not having to send the form 1095C and 1094B to employees, the employer needs to prepare the notice of availability of the 1095C in good faith compliance with the statute, since we don't have IRS guidance yet, and issue those notices to employees so that the employer does not have to file or provide the Form 1095C to employees. If that notice isn't sent, then this relief doesn't apply. So if the employer wants to take advantage of this, which I imagine everyone would want to take advantage of, the employer should prepare this notice of availability of the Form 1095C or 1094B. So that'll wrap up this good news edition of the Benefits Companion. If you have any questions or suggestions of future episodes of this podcast, please contact me. You can also visit our employee benefits page at williamsmullen.com/employee benefits. There you can find out more about our team, as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. Finally, be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening.